The Blackwood Lighthouse was abandoned years ago. Its last keeper vanished. Yet on February 8, 2026, its beam suddenly cut through the night sky. Tonight, we uncover the forgotten logs and protocols that explain why that light should never have turned on. The satellite image arrived at the National Maritime Database at 12:47 a.m., flagged by automated systems as an anomaly. At first, the overnight analyst thought it was a glitch, a pixel error perhaps, or interference from a passing aircraft. But when she pulled up the historical data and cross-referenced the coordinates, her coffee went cold in her hand. The flash had come from Blackwood Lighthouse, a structure that had been officially decommissioned in 2019, its lens removed, its power systems dismantled and hauled away by contractors who documented every step of the shutdown process. Yet there it was, a single brilliant pulse of light captured by 3 separate satellites, triangulated to within meters of the lighthouse's exact position on the jagged coastline of northern Maine. The beam had lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then darkness returned, absolute and total, as if the light had never been. By morning, the image had reached the desks of coastal engineers, maritime historians, and eventually investigators like myself, who specialize in unexplained nautical phenomena. The question wasn't just how a lighthouse without power could generate light. The question was why it would activate at precisely midnight, following patterns that matched operational protocols from decades past, protocols that should have died with the building's decommissioning. Blackwood Lighthouse stands on a peninsula so remote that even the locals in the nearest town, 15 miles south, rarely speak of it. Built in 1887, it served faithfully for over a century, guiding vessels through the treacherous rocks that had claimed dozens of ships before its construction. The lighthouse was a solitary posting, requiring keepers to live in isolation for months at a time, their only connection to the mainland a weekly supply boat that often couldn't make the crossing when storms rolled in from the Atlantic. The structure itself is imposing, 70 feet of weathered granite topped by an iron gallery and the lighthouse chamber. The keeper's quarters, built into the base, were Spartan even by historical standards. Those who served there spoke of the endless sound of wind and waves, the way the building groaned during storms, and the peculiar effect of spending night after night watching the beam rotate through the darkness, searching for dangers that might never come. Thomas Vance was the last keeper assigned to Blackwood, though by then the position was largely ceremonial. Automation had taken over most functions years earlier. Vance's job was maintenance and observation, ensuring systems operated correctly and reporting any anomalies. He was 53, a career lighthouse keeper who had requested the Blackwood posting specifically. His supervisor noted that Vance seemed almost eager for the isolation, despite warnings about how the solitude affected some people. Vance arrived in January 2019. The lighthouse was scheduled for decommissioning that spring, replaced by a simple GPS beacon that required no human oversight. For those final months, Vance lived alone in the keeper's quarters, filing routine reports every Tuesday when the supply boat arrived. His logs were brief, professional, noting weather conditions, equipment status, and little else. Then, on March 15, 2019, Vance's weekly report failed to arrive. The supply boat found the lighthouse locked from inside, Vance's belongings still in place, his bed unmade. The last entry in the official logbook was dated March 13th at 8 p.m. Systems normal, visibility poor, wind from the northeast. There was no indication of distress, no explanation for his disappearance. The investigation was brief. Search teams scoured the peninsula and the surrounding waters, but found no trace of Vance. The prevailing theory was that he had fallen from the rocks during a routine inspection. The coastline was treacherous, and several keepers over the years had died in similar accidents. His family, what little of it existed, accepted a death certificate after 6 months. The lighthouse was sealed, its systems dismantled on schedule that summer. But standing here now, looking at that satellite image, knowing what that single flash represents, I can't accept the official explanation. You see, maritime lighting systems don't just activate themselves. The process requires specific sequences, physical switches, and most importantly, a functioning power supply. The decommissioning report stated clearly that all electrical systems had been disconnected, the backup generators drained and removed, even the wiring stripped from the building to prevent any liability issues. So, what generated that light? I spent 3 weeks obtaining permission to access Blackwood Lighthouse, navigating bureaucratic red tape and safety waivers. The structure is technically condemned, its access paths washed away, the peninsula increasingly unstable as coastal erosion does its work. But I had to see it myself. I had to understand what happened on that night, and more pressingly, what happened to Thomas Vance in his final hours as keeper. The boat crossing takes 40 minutes in calm seas. The captain who agreed to take me, a grizzled local named Douglas who'd been running supply runs to the lighthouse since the 1990s, was reluctant to even approach the peninsula. "That place has always had something off about it," he said, as we navigated the channel between the rocks. The keepers who lasted there were always a certain type, quiet types, the kind who didn't mind being alone with their thoughts, or maybe the kind running from something. When I asked if he remembered Thomas Vance, Douglas's expression darkened. Met him twice. Both times he seemed distracted, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Second time I saw him, about a week before he vanished, he asked me a strange question. He asked if I'd ever noticed anything unusual about the timing of the tides around Blackwood. Said they didn't match the published tables. I told him tides were tides, but he just shook his head and went back inside. As we approached the lighthouse, I could see why the structure had earned its ominous reputation. The granite tower rose from the rocks like a tombstone, stained with decades of salt spray and lichen. The windows of the keepers' quarters were dark, several panes broken. The iron gallery surrounding the light chamber had rusted to a deep orange brown, and the access door hung at an angle, its hinges corroded. But it was the silence that struck me most forcefully. Despite the wind and the constant crash of waves, there was a deadness to the air around Blackwood, as if sound itself was being absorbed by the stones. And looking up at that dark lens chamber, knowing it had somehow blazed to life just days ago, I felt the first real chill of understanding. Something happened here in March 2019, something that wasn't recorded in any official report. And whatever Thomas Vance discovered in his final hours as keeper, it was important enough to make him break his silence 7 years after his disappearance, sending a signal that cut through the night like a scream. The interior of Blackwood Lighthouse smelled of rot and salt corrosion. Douglas had agreed to wait for exactly 2 hours before returning to shore, giving me a narrow window to search the structure. I started in the keeper's quarters, where Vance had spent his final months alone. The main room was as the investigation reports had described, a simple space with a cot, a writing desk, and a small galley kitchen. Water damage had warped the floorboards, and bird droppings covered every horizontal surface. But beneath the decay, I could see traces of Vance's occupation. A calendar on the wall stopped at March 2019. A coffee mug on the desk, long since dried to a brown stain. And something the official investigators had apparently overlooked. A small handprint on the window, pressed against the glass from the inside, as if someone had stood there for hours, staring out at the ocean. The decommissioning report was stored in a waterproof case I'd brought with me, and I spread it across the desk now, brushing away the dust. According to the documentation, contractors from Coastal Systems, Inc. had arrived on June 4, 2019, nearly 3 months after Vance's disappearance. Their work order was straightforward: remove all electrical components, disconnect the primary and backup power systems, remove the lighthouse lens and rotating mechanism, and sealed the structure against unauthorized entry. The report included photographs of each step. I saw images of contractors removing wiring, dismantling the diesel generator in the basement, even extracting the massive Fresnel lens from the light chamber and carefully packing it for transport to a maritime museum. The final page was a sign-off sheet with 4 signatures, certifying that Blackwood Lighthouse was fully decommissioned and incapable of operation. Yet something in those photographs nagged at me. In one image, showing the contractors working in the basement, I could see a metal cabinet in the background, partially obscured by shadows. The door hung open, its lock corroded away. Inside, I found exactly what I'd hoped for and feared: a secondary electrical system that the decommissioning team had either missed or deliberately left in place. The wiring was older, dating back to the lighthouse's original construction based on the cloth-wrapped insulation, but someone had modified it relatively recently, adding modern components and what appeared to be a battery backup system. More disturbing was the crude diagram taped to the inside of the cabinet door. It showed the lighthouse's electrical layout, with certain circuits highlighted in red marker. Handwritten notes in the margins read, "Primary disconnect, baseline systems only," and "Emergency protocol independent of main grid." The handwriting was tight and precise, almost obsessive in its neatness. Thomas Vance knew about this secondary system. More than that, he documented it, studied it, and apparently kept it secret from his supervisors. But why? I photographed everything in the cabinet, then continued my search of the basement. In a corner, partially hidden by fallen ceiling tiles, I found a metal footlocker with Vance's name stenciled on the lid. The lock had been forced, though whether it was investigators or someone else, I couldn't tell. Inside was a collection of items that painted a more complete picture of the man who'd vanished from this place. Personal effects: a watch that had stopped at 11:47, a water-damaged paperback novel, and a photograph of a woman and young girl, their faces too degraded to make out clearly. But beneath these items was something far more valuable: a leather-bound notebook filled with Vance's handwriting, separate from the official logbook he'd been required to maintain. The first entries were mundane: observations about the weather, notes on minor repairs, even a grocery list for the next supply boat. But around mid-February, the tone shifted. Vance began recording unusual phenomena. February 16th, The lighthouse beacon dimmed at 11:47 p.m. without system malfunction, returned to full power at 11:52, logged as electrical anomaly. Then days later, February 23rd, same dimming pattern, same time. Checked all systems, no explanation. Started reviewing historical maintenance logs to see if this is a known issue. March entries grew more urgent. March 3rd, found reference in 1962 maintenance manual to auxiliary activation protocols. No details provided. Requested information from district office. No response yet. And then, March 8th, discovered secondary electrical system in the basement, not mentioned in any modern documentation. Appears designed to operate independently. Why was this kept secret? The final entries, dated March 12th and 13th, were the most disturbing. March 12th, translated the activation protocol. It's not for navigation. The system is designed to respond to specific environmental conditions, barometric pressure, water temperature, and tidal patterns that occur only during certain astronomical alignments. The next alignment occurs March 15th at midnight. I need to understand what this protocol is meant to do before that date. And then the last entry, written in a hand that showed signs of stress. March 13th, 11:30 p.m. I was wrong about everything. The protocol isn't for activating the light. It's for ensuring someone is here when it activates. The lighthouse doesn't send signals out. It receives them. I can hear it now, even with the beacon off. A low-frequency pulse coming from the direction of the deep water trench 8 miles northeast. The pulse matches the rhythm of the tidal anomalies. Something is out there, and it's been waiting for someone to notice. I'm going to follow the protocol instructions. If I'm right, the light will activate tomorrow at midnight, and whatever has been calling from the trench will finally make itself known. If I'm wrong, the entry ended mid-sentence. I sat in that cold basement reading those words by flashlight and felt the full weight of what Vance had discovered. He hadn't disappeared accidentally. He'd done something deliberately, following instructions from a protocol that predated modern record-keeping. And if his timeline was correct, the protocol had activated exactly as he predicted, just 7 years late. What had delayed it, and more pressingly, what had finally triggered it on February 8, 2026? Outside, I could hear Douglas's boat horn, the first warning that my time was running out, but I couldn't leave yet. I had to find the protocol itself, the actual document that explained what Vance had activated. Because if the lighthouse had indeed received a signal from something 8 miles northeast in waters that dropped to over 3,000 feet deep, then that signal had been answered by the midnight flash. Something had called, and Blackwood Lighthouse had responded. The lighthouse's upper levels were in worse condition than the basement. Decades of storm damage had left the stairs partially collapsed, and I had to climb carefully, testing each step before trusting my weight to it. The walls were streaked with rust stains from the deteriorating metalwork, and in several places I could see completely through to the outside where the mortar had crumbled away between the stones. The light chamber itself was a hollow shell. The massive Fresnel lens was gone, removed during the decommissioning, leaving only the mounting brackets and the rotating mechanism's base. But it was the small room adjacent to the light chamber, the keeper's watch room, that held what I was searching for. This was where the operational manuals had been kept, where keepers would reference procedures during their shifts, monitoring weather conditions and making entries in the official logs. The built-in bookshelf was still there, though most of its contents had been removed or destroyed by moisture. What remained were fragments of older documents, their pages swollen and stuck together from years of humidity. I worked carefully, peeling pages apart with the edge of my knife, photographing anything legible. Most of it was useless. Requisition forms from the 1980s, weather observation protocols, basic maintenance checklists. But wedged behind the shelf's backing board, I found something that had been deliberately hidden, a manila envelope sealed with wax and marked with a date, December 1961. The envelope's contents were still dry, protected by the waxy seal and the shelf's backing. Inside were 3 documents, all typed on official United States Coast Guard letterhead. The first was a memorandum marked "Confidential, Lighthouse Keepers Only," and addressed to all personnel stationed at Blackwood Lighthouse. It read, "Effective immediately. All keepers assigned to Blackwood Station are to be briefed on Emergency Activation Protocol Code Nightingale. This protocol supersedes all standard operational procedures and is to be implemented only under the specific conditions outlined in the technical specifications. Keepers are prohibited from discussing Code Nightingale with civilians, including family members, under penalty of dismissal and potential legal action. The protocol exists to ensure navigational safety during rare but potentially catastrophic oceanographic events. Further questions should be directed to District Command." It was the third document that made my blood run cold. It was titled Code Nightingale, Activation Procedure. And unlike the technical specifications, this was complete and unredacted. The protocol was written in the clear, methodical language of military operations. Step 1. When seismic monitoring equipment registers vibrations matching the specified frequency pattern, see attached chart, keeper must immediately proceed to the auxiliary power system in basement level. Step 2. Activate backup generator using the emergency start sequence. Do not use standard operational power systems. Step 3. Ascend to light chamber and manually engage the rotating mechanism. Set beacon to maximum intensity. Step 4. Maintain beacon operation for exactly 4 seconds, then immediately shut down all systems. Step 5. Proceed to keeper's quarters and monitor shortwave radio on frequency 4625 kHz for further instructions. Do not leave the lighthouse under any circumstances until all clear signal from District Command. Step 6. Under no circumstances should the keeper attempt to investigate the source of the seismic activity. The beacon serves as acknowledgement only. Acknowledgement of receipt by designated parties is essential to prevent escalation protocols. Warning: failure to properly execute Code Nightingale may result in catastrophic navigational hazards affecting all vessels within a 50-mile radius. The keeper must remain at the station until explicitly relieved by authorized personnel. I read the procedure 3 times, trying to reconcile its bureaucratic language with the implications hidden beneath. It wasn't about navigation in any conventional sense. The reference to designated parties and escalation protocols suggested something far more complex and potentially military in nature. The attached chart showed a frequency pattern, a low-frequency pulse, rhythmic and regular, that matched exactly what Vance had described in his personal notebook. He'd heard it, he'd identified it, and according to his final log entry, he'd followed the protocol. But the protocol was dated 1961, more than 60 years ago. Why would something established during the height of the Cold War suddenly activate in 2019? And more pressingly, why would it activate again 7 years later in 2026 at a lighthouse that had been decommissioned and abandoned? I pulled out my phone and checked the date of the recent activation. February 8th, 2026, at precisely midnight. Then I did something that should have occurred to me sooner. I checked the astronomical conditions for that date. What I found sent chills down my spine. February 8th, 2026 marked a rare alignment, a new moon coinciding with the moon's closest approach to Earth in elliptical elliptical orbit, combined with a specific tidal configuration that occurred only once every several decades. The resulting tidal forces would be extraordinary, affecting ocean currents, pressure systems, and potentially triggering seismic activity in tectonically unstable areas, like the deep water trench 8 miles northeast of Blackwood Lighthouse. I pulled up geological surveys on my phone using the lighthouse's spotty cellular signal. The Northeast Continental Trench, that was its official name, was a relatively unexplored underwater canyon that dropped to depths exceeding 10,000 feet. The Navy had conducted sonar mapping in the 1960s as part of submarine detection efforts during the Cold War, but the surveys had been classified and the area marked as a navigational hazard. The timing aligned perfectly. Code Nightingale had been established in 1961, right when those naval surveys would have been conducted. The protocol wasn't for shipping navigation, it was a response system, a way of acknowledging something that the Navy had discovered in those depths. But acknowledged to whom? Or to what? Thomas Vance had figured this out. He'd found the protocol, understood its purpose, and when the conditions aligned in March 2019, he'd executed it exactly as instructed. The beacon had flashed for 4 seconds. I could confirm that now, cross-referencing historical weather satellite data from that night. The pulse had been recorded, dismissed at the time as a sensor glitch because everyone knew Blackwood was scheduled for decommissioning. Vance had activated the protocol. He'd sent the signal. And then he'd waited in the keeper's quarters for further instructions that, according to the protocol, should have come via shortwave radio. But what if those instructions never came? What if whatever was supposed to respond to that signal had failed to do so? That would explain why the protocol had activated again, 7 years later, an automatic retry, perhaps, triggered by the same astronomical conditions occurring again. I checked the charts. The next time those specific conditions would align was February 2033, 7 years from now. The pattern was consistent, mechanical, inevitable. Whatever code Nightingale was designed to communicate with, it operated on its own timeline, indifferent to human decommissioning orders or the passage of years. And if the pattern held, it would activate again and again until it received whatever response it was designed to elicit. I gathered the documents and prepared to descend the stairs. Douglas's boat horn sounded again, more insistent now. But as I turned to leave the watchroom, something caught my eye, a detail I'd missed in my initial search. On the wall beside the window, someone had scratched a message into the plaster with something sharp. The letters were crude but clear. It answered. It's rising. Protocol failed. The handwriting matched Thomas Vance's notebook entries. The boat ride back to shore was rough, the wind picking up as afternoon shadows lengthened across the water. Douglas didn't ask about what I'd found, and I didn't volunteer the information. Some discoveries need time to process before they can be articulated, and what I'd uncovered at Blackwood Lighthouse fell into that category. But I couldn't stop thinking about Vance's scratched message. It answered. It's rising. Protocol failed. Those 3 sentences contained a narrative that contradicted everything the official investigation had concluded. Vance hadn't fallen from the rocks. He hadn't wandered off in confusion or suffered some medical emergency. He'd executed a military protocol, received a response that terrified him, and then what? Disappeared? Fled? Or was taken? Back in my hotel room, I spread out the documents I'd photographed and began the painstaking work of piecing together Vance's final hours. The official logbook entries ended at 8 p.m. on March 13th, but his personal notebook continued until 11:30 p.m. that night. That left a window of 12.5 hours before the midnight activation. I needed to understand what happened in that gap. The answer came from an unexpected source. While researching historical records, I discovered that the Coast Guard had installed an automated data logger at Blackwood in 2018, part of a weather monitoring network. The logger was supposed to transmit data hourly, but after Vance's disappearance, the records had been archived without analysis, just raw numbers stored in a database that few people knew existed and fewer bothered to access. It took 6 hours of bureaucratic navigation, but I finally obtained access to the data files. What they revealed was extraordinary. The environmental sensors had recorded everything: barometric pressure, wind speed and direction, water temperature at various depths, and most crucially, a seismic sensor that detected water-bound vibrations. The data from March 13th through March 15th, 2019 told a story that Vance's fragmented notes could only hint at. The seismic activity began at 11:47 p.m. on March 13th, the exact time Vance's watch had stopped, I realized with a chill. The vibrations were low frequency, rhythmic, and unlike any naturally occurring seismic event. The pattern matched exactly the frequency chart attached to the Code Nightingale protocol. For 3 minutes the signal pulsed, then stopped abruptly at 11:50 p.m. Vance must have heard it, felt it. Perhaps that's when his watch broke, the vibrations interfering with its mechanism. This was his trigger, the condition that Code Nightingale had been designed to detect. The environmental data continued. At 11:52 p.m., Vance activated the basement power system. I could see it in the spike of electrical current recorded by the logger. At 11:55 p.m., he was in the light chamber, starting the rotating mechanism. The logger recorded the power draw, the heat signature from the beacon as it warmed up. Then, at exactly midnight on March 14th, the beacon flashed. 4 seconds, maximum intensity, just as the protocol specified. For 3 minutes after the beacon flash, the sensors recorded normal conditions. I imagined Vance in the keeper's quarters, following step 5 of the protocol, tuning the shortwave radio to frequency 4625 kHz, waiting for instructions that should have come from district command. But at 12:03 a.m., something changed. The seismic sensor registered a massive spike in activity, vibrations so intense that the logger's scale nearly maxed out. The pattern was different now, not the rhythmic pulse from before, but a sustained, powerful resonance that lasted for 7 minutes. The water temperature sensors told an even more disturbing story. In the space of those 7 minutes, the temperature at depth, measured by a buoy stationed over the northeast continental trench, rose by 12 degrees Fahrenheit. 12 degrees in 7 minutes. That was physically impossible through natural processes. Whatever was generating those vibrations was also producing enormous amounts of heat. And then at 12:10 a.m., all sensors went dead. Every single one. The logger's final entry read, "System fault, sensor array offline, last transmission 12:10:37 a.m." The equipment was never repaired because by the time maintenance crews could reach Blackwood, Vance had been reported missing and the lighthouse was scheduled to be decommissioned. The sensor failure was attributed to storm damage, just another casualty of the harsh coastal environment. But I knew better now. Those sensors hadn't failed naturally. Something had disabled them. Something that didn't want its presence recorded or measured. I turned back to Vance's personal notebook, reading his final entry with new understanding. He'd written it at 11:30 p.m., half an hour before the protocol would activate. He'd known what was coming, had prepared himself for it, but he'd been wrong about one crucial detail. He thought the lighthouse was receiving signals. He thought something in the trench was calling out, and the beacon was meant to acknowledge that call. But the protocol's language suggested something different. Acknowledgement of receipt by designated parties is essential to prevent escalation. The beacon wasn't answering a call. It was preventing something. And whatever Vance had prevented, or failed to prevent, happened in those 7 minutes between the beacon flash and the sensor failure. I needed to find someone who understood Code Nightingale, someone who'd been present when the protocol was established in 1961. That meant tracking down former Coast Guard personnel who'd served during that era, men who would now be in their 80s or 90s if they were still alive. The search took 2 days, but I finally located retired Captain James Holloway, who'd served as district commander for the Maine coast from 1959 to 1964. He was 92 years old, living in a nursing home in Portland, and according to his daughter, his memory was sharp despite his age. I visited him on a gray afternoon, bringing copies of the Code Nightingale documents. When I showed him the memorandum from 1961, his expression shifted, recognition mixed with something that looked like fear. "I hoped these had been destroyed," he said quietly. "We were ordered to burn all copies after the protocol was mothballed in 1975. I thought we'd done it." What was Code Nightingale really about? What was in that trench? Holloway was silent for a long time, staring at the documents. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "In 1960, we found something during submarine detection exercises. A structure on the trench floor, artificial, enormous. The Navy sent down a remote submersible, and it transmitted images for about 40 seconds before the signal cut out. We never recovered the submersible." What did the images show? A door, made of something that wasn't stone or metal, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And around the door there were markings, symbols that didn't match any known language. But the worst part was, the door appeared to be sealed from our side, as if it was designed to keep something in rather than keep something out. He paused, his hands trembling slightly. The vibrations started after that first submersible dive, low-frequency pulses, regular like a heartbeat. The Navy's analysts said it was like the door had woken up, that our probe had triggered some kind of automated response. Code Nightingale was developed as a countermeasure, a way to signal that we'd received the transmission and understood it was there, hoping that acknowledgement would keep the door sealed. And it worked? For decades, yes. Whenever conditions aligned, specific tidal forces, moon phases, the pulses would start, and we'd activate the beacon. 4 seconds, maximum intensity. The pulses would stop, and everything would go quiet again. We did this for 15 years before someone in Washington decided the whole thing was superstitious nonsense. The protocol was canceled, the documentation ordered destroyed, and everyone involved was sworn to secrecy. I showed him the sensor data from March 14, 2019, the temperature spike, the sustained vibrations, the sensor failure. Holloway's face went pale. That Vance fellow, he followed the protocol exactly as written. Then he made the same mistake we did in 1975. The beacon isn't a simple acknowledgement. It's a key. It has to be activated at specific intervals to maintain the seal. When we stopped the protocol in 1975, we thought nothing would happen because nothing had happened immediately. But seals don't break all at once. They weaken gradually, over years, over decades. And when conditions align strongly enough, when the tidal forces are exactly right, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Something tried to open the door, I said. Holloway nodded. And your Mr. Vance was there when it happened. Captain Holloway's revelation transformed everything I thought I understood about Blackwood Lighthouse. This wasn't a ghost story or an unexplained mystery. It was evidence of a systematic cover-up spanning 6 decades. A cover-up that had likely cost Thomas Vance's life. But one question remained unanswered. Why had the beacon activated again on February 8, 2026, 7 years after Vance's disappearance? The lighthouse had no power, no keeper, no one to execute the protocol. Yet the satellite imagery was undeniable. The beacon had flashed. The answer came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the decommissioning documents one final time, I noticed something I'd previously overlooked. The contractor's report included a detailed inventory of removed items, but it also listed several items that were unable to be removed due to structural integration. Most of these were mundane, mounting brackets, sealed pipe systems, but one entry caught my eye. Automated fail-safe system. Basement level. Removal would compromise structural integrity. Recommend leaving in place with power disconnected. Automated fail-safe system. Those words hadn't appeared in any other documentation. I needed to return to Blackwood. Douglas was reluctant to make another crossing. "Storm's coming in tomorrow," he said. "Could be the last calm day for weeks." But he agreed for double his usual fee, and we made the crossing at dawn. The lighthouse looked different in the gray morning light, less ominous, but somehow more desolate. I went straight to the basement, back to the metal cabinet with its modified electrical systems. This time, I looked past the obvious components, searching for what I'd missed before. Behind the main panel, partially concealed by the cabinet's frame, I found it. A small black box, no larger than a car battery, with its own independent power supply, solar cells, and a wind turbine connection. This device could operate indefinitely without external power, and on its face, a simple digital display showed a countdown timer. The timer read, "Next activation, 2033 02 08 000000. 7 years from now, exactly as I'd calculated. This failsafe system was executing code Nightingale automatically, following the protocol even though the lighthouse was abandoned and decommissioned. Someone had installed this device, likely Vance himself based on the modification style, to ensure the beacon would flash at the required intervals, maintaining whatever seal existed on that deep water door. But there was another component to the device, one that chilled me more than the countdown timer. A data logger, similar to the one that had recorded Vance's final night, but this one was still functioning. I connected my laptop and downloaded its files. The data began on March 15, 2019 at 12:11 a.m., 1 minute after the Coast Guard sensor array went offline. For the next 6 hours, this independent logger had recorded everything the official equipment had missed. What I saw in those files defied rational explanation. The seismic activity continued until 6 a.m., the vibrations gradually decreasing but never stopping completely. Water temperature at depth had remained elevated for hours, and starting at 3 a.m., the logger had detected something new: acoustic signals that weren't seismic in nature but deliberate, structured, almost mathematical in their precision. Someone or something had been trying to communicate. The acoustic signals repeated every 7 minutes, each sequence lasting exactly 4 seconds. A mirror of the beacon's flash, an answer to Vance's signal. And encoded in those acoustic pulses was a pattern that the logger's basic AI analysis software had flagged as potentially linguistic in nature. I wasn't equipped to decode an alien language, if that's what this was, but I didn't need to understand the message to grasp its implication. Something behind that sealed door had responded to the beacon. It had acknowledged the signal, and now it was trying to establish communication. The acoustic signals continued for 3 days before stopping abruptly on March 18, 2019. The same day that Coast Guard investigators officially closed the case on Thomas Vance's disappearance, attributing it to accidental drowning. Had anyone else heard these signals? Had anyone realized what they represented? Or had the cover-up extended to suppressing this evidence as well? I copied all the data and prepared to leave, but before I did, I checked the failsafe device one last time. There was a manual override option, a physical switch that could disable the automatic countdown. I could stop the next activation right now, prevent the beacon from flashing in 2033, break the cycle that had been running since 1961. My hand hovered over the switch. If Holloway was right, if the beacon was maintaining some kind of seal, then disabling it could be catastrophic. But if the beacon was actually encouraging whatever was behind that door, if each flash was weakening rather than strengthening the seal, then continuing the protocol might be equally dangerous. I thought about Thomas Vance, standing in this same basement 7 years ago, making similar calculations. He'd followed the protocol precisely, done everything correctly according to the instructions, and something had gone wrong anyway, wrong enough that he'd scratched a warning on the wall before he disappeared. Protocol failed. In the end, I left the switch alone. This decision was too large for one person to make, required expertise far beyond my own. But I couldn't leave without taking one final action. I modified the failsafe device, adding a cellular transmitter that would alert me when the countdown reached its final hour in 2033. Whatever was going to happen, I would be there to witness it. We left Blackwood Lighthouse as the first storm clouds rolled in from the Atlantic. By evening, the peninsula was cut off, invisible behind sheets of rain and spray. It would be months before anyone could return. In my hotel room that night, I compiled everything I'd discovered into a comprehensive report. The historical documents, the sensor data, Holloway's testimony, the fail-safe device's logs, all of it painted a picture of something that official channels had deliberately suppressed for over 60 years. I submitted the report to 3 different agencies: the Coast Guard, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the Department of Defense. 2 weeks later, all 3 responded with nearly identical letters stating that my findings were based on misinterpretation of historical data and that no further investigation was warranted. The cover-up was still active, still protecting whatever secret lay at the bottom of the Northeast Continental Trench. But I wasn't done. I had 7 years to prepare for the next activation, 7 years to find answers that the government refused to provide. I would return to Blackwood in 2033 on February 8th at midnight, and I would finally discover what Thomas Vance had learned in his final moments. Tonight, as I write this, sometimes I stand at my window and look toward the northern coast, toward the dark stretch of water where Blackwood Lighthouse stands silent and abandoned. In 7 years, that beacon will flash again, sending its 4-second pulse into the darkness. And somewhere in the depths, in the absolute darkness of the trench, something will receive that signal, something that has been patient for decades, perhaps for centuries or millennia, something that knows we've been watching, that we've discovered its presence, that we've been trying to keep it sealed away. The beacon was meant to be an acknowledgement, a way of saying, "We know you're there, please stay where you are." But acknowledgement is also recognition, and recognition implies awareness on both sides. Whatever is behind that door in the trench, it knows we're here too. It's been trying to communicate, sending its own signals back, patient and persistent. And with each activation of Code Nightingale, with each 4-second pulse from Blackwood Lighthouse, the conversation continues. Thomas Vance understood this in his final hours. He realized that the protocol wasn't preventing anything, it was maintaining contact. And when he saw what that contact had summoned, what had responded to the beacon's acknowledgement, he knew the truth that the government had been hiding since 1961. We're not keeping something sealed away, we're keeping something engaged. And the question that haunts me now, the question that will haunt me until February 8th, 2033, is this: what happens if we stop? What happens if that conversation finally ends, and whatever has been patiently waiting in the dark decides it no longer needs our permission to rise? The beacon will flash again in 7 years. The protocol will execute automatically, mechanical and inevitable. And somewhere in the depths, something will answer. I'll be at Blackwood Lighthouse when it does, not to prevent the activation. That choice has been made by systems set in motion decades ago. But to witness what Vance witnessed, to understand what the government has been hiding, and to finally learn what lies behind the door at the bottom of the Northeast Continental Trench. Until then, the lighthouse stands dark and silent on its lonely peninsula, but in its basement, a small device counts down the hours, maintaining a vigil that has lasted for more than 60 years. And in the depths of the ocean, in the absolute darkness of the trench, something waits with infinite patience, knowing that eventually, inevitably, the beacon will flash again. The conversation continues. The seal holds for now. And we're left with the chilling certainty that some doors, once discovered, can never truly be closed. We can only keep watching, keep signaling, keep maintaining the fragile acknowledgement that might be the only thing standing between us and whatever waits in the deep. The Blackwood Lighthouse beacon turned on by itself at midnight. Now you know why. And now, like me, you'll spend the next 7 years wondering if it should have been allowed to go dark forever.